In the beginning of this week's parsha, we have Moshe Rabbeinu speaking to the Yidden, telling them everything that happened from the time they were at Har Sinai. Moshe Rabbeinu says, Hashem Elokeinu diber eleinu b'chorev. Hashem spoke to us at Har Sinai. Lamar saying, Rav lachem sheves b'hor hazeh. We'll see in a minute what those words mean. So Rashi explains, Rav lachem sheves. Rashi has two explanations. First of all, Rashi says, kibshutoi, that it means simply, which, as we'll see, what that means is that Moshe Rabbeinu was telling the Yidden that Hashem is saying, you stayed at the mountain for too long, Rav lachem, more than enough. And then there's a Medrash Haggadah that says that Rav is more from the word of ribu, it means a lot. Harbe lachem, there's lots of greatness and reward for sitting at this mountain. Rashi says and explains what that's referring to. Asisa Mishkan, you made a Mishkan, the Menorah, the Kalim, you received the Torah, you appointed Sanhedrin, including Sari Alafim, officers over thousands, officers over hundreds. This is the second Pirush in Rav Lachem. The Rebbe asks a number of questions. Number one, why do we need this midrashic explanation if there's the Pirush Kipshuta, if there's the simple explanation? Number two, and Rashi does discuss the great things that happen in Har Sinai, why doesn't Rashi enumerate and mention that which the pasuk itself later in Chumash refers to as a great thing? We're speaking about great things that happened by this mountain. The pasuk itself says, Hasham Ma'am, was there any nation that ever heard the sound of Hashem talking to them from the fire? In other words, the great godly revelation that happened at Har Sinai. Why doesn't Rashi mention that? In fact, says the Rebbe, regarding the points that Rashi does mention, which is receiving the Torah and appointing Sanhedrin, seemingly there wasn't even such a great chidush in these things on their own by Har Sinai, because Torah and mitzvahs are things that the Avos had already, Yidden had already a lot of it previously. They learned Torah, they did mitzvahs. The idea of appointing Sanhedrin judges is also something that existed before, so this is not even such a great chidush right now. So why is this even being mentioned as the greatness that happened there? The Rebbe now looks at the order of what Rashi mentions of the things that happened at Har Sinai. The Mishkan was made, receiving the Torah, and appointing Sanhedrin. Now, seemingly, this is actually the opposite of the way, it's not an order of how it actually happened. Because first there was the receiving of the Torah, then there was the appointing of the Sanhedrin, and only then came the making of the Mishkan. The Rebbe also asks, why is it when the Rashi mentions about making the Mishkan, he mentions the Menorah specifically, besides outside of all the other Kalim of the Mishkan? And finally, the Rebbe asks, in regards to the Sanhedrin, Rashi mentions Sari Alafim and Sari Meis, the officers over thousands and over hundreds, but Rashi does not mention what the Torah also speaks about, that there was also Sari Chamishim and Sari Asaris, officers over 50s and officers over groups of 10. The Rebbe says these questions become even stronger. A number of these things that we just asked Rashi, when we look in the source, in the Sifri, seemingly there they say it in a way that wouldn't have these questions. And the Rebbe also compares and asks some other differences between Rashi and the Sifri. We're not going to go into all of those details right now. But the Rebbe says the explanation is that according to the first Pirush, which is the simple Pirush of Rav Lachem, which Hashem is saying that you have stayed by Har Sinai longer than enough, much more than you should have, the question is, staying by Har Sinai was obviously something very great, very necessary. There was so much benefit in it for the Yidden. How could you possibly say it's more than enough? If anything, what could have been said is, instead of Rav Lachem, it could have said, die, it's enough. You sat here enough, long enough, and now you have to move on. But what does it mean to say it's more than enough, Rav Lachem? And that's why Rashi does have to say that nevertheless, the Pirush is still Kipshuta. Yes, it does mean you were here too long, more than enough, because of the context of what Moshe Rabbeinu is trying to tell them. It in fact was too long, as we'll explain soon why that is. In order to explain this, says the Rebbe, just first a more general idea, and that is that these few psukim that Moshe Rabbeinu is now telling them, that Hashem told them at Har Sinai, you were here too long, and now move on and travel to Eretz Yisrael. When we look in the original story where it happened, here Moshe Rabbeinu is only repeating it. When we look in Chumash Bamidbar, when this all takes place, we actually don't find this dibur, this statement of Hashem. Why is it necessary over here when Moshe is repeating what happened to mention it? Because Moshe Rabbeinu is trying to explain to the Yidden that Hashem really wanted that immediately from Har Sinai, they should have gone straight into Eretz Yisrael. And that it is only because of their sins, the Chet HaMeraglim, that they were now delayed these 40 years in the Midbar. And now we can understand what Moshe Rabbeinu is telling them that Hashem said. Hashem says, Rav Lochem, you're here way too long. What's he trying to emphasize with this? He's trying to say is that Hashem so much wanted you to go to Eretz Yisrael that despite all of the great things that are by Har Sinai, nevertheless, every single moment you hear is too long because you should be moving already to Eretz Yisrael. The problem with this is that from the words Rav Lochem, that it's here too long, sounds like being by Har Sinai was not according to what Hashem wanted. But that can't be the case because the Yidden always only traveled when Hashem wanted them to travel, when the cloud lifted, etc. So how can you say they're there too long, which sounds like it's not what Hashem wants? This is why Rashi brings another pirush, that Rav Lochem doesn't mean you're here more than enough, but rather from the word of ribuif, that there's plenty great things that happened over here at Har Sinai, and lots of reward and lots of greatness. But Rashi wants to explain to us that even according to this pirush, the message is still the same. That as a result of this, Yidden should be rushing into going into Eretz Yisrael. And that's why Rashi brings these three specific things that he mentions that happened by Har Sinai, and specifically in this order, in order to show that because they have these three things, they're definitely ready to go immediately into Eretz Yisrael. How does this work? Because in order for Yidden to go into Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Neishev is a settled, a regular land, a regular normal order of life now, and yet we want that the Yidden shouldn't forget about their uniqueness, how they're different to the other nations. We first need to ensure and strengthen the idea that it should be permanently set inside of them, the idea that they are Mamleches Koyanim and a Goy Kodesh, a special nation, a holy nation. And this happens at Har Sinai, which caused and brought about in them in the most perfect way these three things that we're going to discuss now, how this brings out in them the Goy Kodesh. Number one, they are a Goy Kodesh. Why are they a Goy Kodesh, a holy nation? Because Hashem is dwelling inside of them. V'shachanti b'soichem. And how does that happen? That happens specifically through the Mishkan, which is a permanent place for Hashem to dwell amongst the Yidden. The Rebbe says, now we'll also understand why Rashi doesn't mention about the Giluyim, the great revelations that happened at Har Sinai, because that was only temporary. That's not something that they took with them in a permanent way into Eretz Yisrael. That's why Rashi didn't mention that point. So the first thing is Hashem is dwelling amongst you. And where is it happening? Practically, it's happening in the Mishkan. We now also understand why Rashi mentions the menorah, because Chazal say that it was the menorah specifically. That was the Eidos, that was the testimony to the rest of the world, testifying that the Shekhinah dwells amongst the Yidden. Then comes the idea of Kabbalah Satorah. Why? Because the way the Kedusha is actually going to impact the daily conduct and behavior of the Yid is by accepting and receiving the Torah, the instructions from Hashem. And finally, that's why Rashi brings that second. And finally, in order for Yidden to be able to carry out the instructions of the Torah properly, for that you have the Sanhedrin that are going to teach the Yidden the Hayrois of the Torah, the directives of the Torah, how to act practically. Says the Rebbe, if this is all about how the Yidden are going to come into Eretz Yisrael and be the way they're supposed to be, this is also why Rashi does not mention, as we said before, the Sari Chamishim and Sari Asaris, because the need for so many leaders over little groups, that was mainly while they were wandering in the Midbar, they needed more of this special care of the leaders over every little group, where once they come into Eretz Yisrael, there's no need for that anymore. And that's why Rashi doesn't mention it. The Rebbe now moves on with some very powerful Hayrois from this Rashi. Number one, says the Rebbe, the Hayrah from the first Pirush, that they're by Har Sinai too long. Now we're speaking about Har Sinai, a great place, great godly revelation. And the message is that no matter how high a Yid is in his Avodah, you should never stay in one place for too long. You always need to be increasing in your Avodas Hashem, moving on. Number two, says the Rebbe, we had two Pirushim over here. Number one, that you need to rush into Eretz Yisrael. Number two, that the Yidden have the Hachana Ruchen, is the spiritual Hachana to go into Eretz Yisrael. They have the Mishkan, they have the Torah, they have the Sanhedrin. Says the Rebbe, these two explanations really are connected and linked with each other, dependent on each other. In other words, it's because the Yidden are a Goy Kodesh, because they have all of these special things, the Mishkan and the Torah, etc. That is what really creates and makes them connected to Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, they need to now rush into Eretz Yisrael. And not only rushing in time-wise, but they're going to come quickly into Eretz Yisrael, as it should have been then, without any wars, without any weapons. No one's going to stop them. And the Rebbe explains, by Goyim, when they get a land, it's not that the land is essentially connected to them, and that's why they're going to have to fight for it, they're going to have to put up a war for it. By Yidden, Eretz Yisrael is essentially connected with their very Metzias through a bond, through a covenant of Hashem, which can never be cancelled out. And when Yidden act as a Goy Kodesh, as a holy nation in an open and revealed way, then it also comes out in a revealed way that we clearly see their connection to Eretz Yisrael in a revealed way as well, and then no one would ever get up against the Yidden, they wouldn't have to fight. And says the Rebbe, that's exactly what should happen right now, that we'll have the whole Eretz Yisrael, b'shleimus, without any war, without any problems, b'meheira v'yameinu mamash.